Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning to the ones probably in the US. It's a pleasure to be here and host the final webinar of our series, Innovation in a Regional Context. It has been a pleasure to host this event in the name of the Innovation Working Group, and I really appreciate and thank a lot Igor and the Urban and Regional Working Group for this partnership. It was very productive, and we are very happy for the results. And we are also very happy to introduce here Professor Jennifer Clark, that very kindly accepted our invitation. And today she's going to talk about her paper, Resilient Regions and Open Innovation, the Evolution of Smart Cities and Civil Entrepreneurship. Just a small introduction. Professor Clark is an associate professor at Georgia Tech, Georgia Institute of Technology. She is a director of the Center for Urban Innovation and associate director for Smart Cities and Inclusive Innovation. Her research is focused mainly in urban and regional economic development theory, analysis and practice, research design, and methods. So she has been a policy advisor and consultant for OECD, European Commission, and the UK and US government. And it's a very big pleasure to have you here, Professor Clark. And I'll just briefly explain how this presentation will work. We'll have around 35 to 40 minutes presentation. And after that, we open the floor for questions and answers. So if you have any question, you can either send it to us or post here in the chat, or open your microphone and ask it. So thank you very much, Professor, and the floor is totally yours.
Of course, thank you, and thank you so much for the invitation. This is very kind of you to give me the opportunity to talk with you. I'm particularly interested in being able to talk to the Young Scholars Initiative, and I'm impressed by what you do in terms of organizing these working groups and activities around the working groups. I think it's fantastic. Today, I understand that you're interested in both the title of the talk, Innovation Systems and Regional Resilience, but also some of my research on smart cities as well. So I will, throughout the talk, I will highlight those moments, but you're also more than welcome to ask questions when we get to the end of the talk about the connections between these innovation systems and regional resilience to the smart cities discourse, because they're obviously fairly deeply connected. The other thing I wanted to mention very quickly is I know that there are some opportunities here for further connections that I wanted to share with you. And I know that you have a gathering in Edinburgh coming up, but I also wanted to highlight for you some opportunities beyond that. One of the roles that I serve is as the chair of the Economic Geography Specialty Group of the American Association of Geographers, which is an exceedingly large group. It isn't just American geographers, I'm sure as many of you know, but it's one of the largest gatherings of economic geographers annually. And the call for papers for that is out right now and it's circulating, and I just wanted to draw your attention to that opportunity. Also, the Regional Studies Association, I realize you had a webinar recently from one of my colleagues, Professor Harrison, who also is one of the editors for Regional Studies, that journal. But the association itself has several journals and a book series in addition to multiple meetings, and I wanted to make you aware of that opportunity. Also, and I'll be done in a moment, the Global Conference on Economic Geography is coming up in Cologne in 2018. That happens every 2 years. And that is the largest gathering of economic geographers you could attend in case you have an interest in that. And then finally, the Summer Institute in Economic Geography is in Ghent in 2018, and that is, the Summer Institute is a week-long exercise. Jamie Peck, who some of you may know, has been organizing this since the early 2000s. It's a pretty amazing experience, and you can apply, that's by application only, but for advanced PhD students, postdocs, and for people who are new faculty, that's the scope of what that's for. Okay, so to get to the talk, and I wanted to mention too, I'm providing a slide at the end with the references. This is actually the amalgamation of a number of talks, and you'll see that the papers, the specific papers that relate to this, I will mention at the end. So when we talk about resilience, and particularly the resilience of urban and regional economies, this really depends on the underlying innovation capacities of those cities and regions. And in an era of rapid technological change and devolved governance, Innovation occurs both in policy design and policy implementation, as well as in more familiar domains associated with new products, processes, materials, and markets. Innovation is a factor in how resilient firms, intermediaries, and supply chains face shifting market conditions and absorb new technology. And institutional innovation, and this will be key throughout the talk, is critical to the resilience of governments and institutions to adapt to rapid change. Today, I will talk in particular about the role of intermediaries in creating regional resilience and supporting regional innovation systems. So we go beyond the question of firms and labor markets and research and development here to look at the design and deployment of policy models more broadly. So the key thing here is that there is a complex relationship between innovation and resilience. In recent years, resilience has become a core concept in understanding the long-run viability of economic, political, industrial, and environmental systems, including those systems that sustain cities and regions. Along with sustainability, resilience has entered the lexicon not only as a normative value, but as a variable to operationalize and assess the relative merits of everything from economic policies to infrastructure investments. Resilience speaks to the viability of complex systems to withstand and adapt to change. So increasingly, we see regional resilience present as a complex combination of technological capacities, path dependencies, and institutional factors, including coordination control routines. Much of this relates to the evolutionary economic geography literature, which I mentioned here. As a consequence, what we see is that any theoretical or empirical treatment of resilience really ends up requiring an interdisciplinary approach and a sober look at patterns of growth and decline in local economies. Again, this is the issue that we see over and over again when we talk about regional economic development policies, the idea that we're not just managing growth, we're also managing decline, and sometimes we're actually managing a sort of stagnation. The regional resilience literature parallels efforts in the 1980s and 1990s to understand why some places were sticky in the global economy, those places that retain firms and jobs, and other spaces that were slippery, losing established specializations as production decamped to alternate locations. And you all will remember that conversation from Anne Markison's famous work in 1990s. So policy discussions of regional development have recently shifted from a focus on growth and competitiveness, this in part has to do with the recession, to the analysis of the relative resilience of regional economies in response to rapid transitions of technologies, markets, and exogenous economic shocks like recessions, but we see increasingly things like natural disasters and hurricanes. This emphasis on sustainable regions rather than economic growth extends research on things, ideas like learning regions, which you can see as a subcomponent here of regional and territorial innovation systems, and the innovative milieu language, which was more popular really in the 2000s and the 1990s, to a broader conceptualization of embedded institutional adaptive capacities, and that's really where resilience comes in. It also revisits the use of natural systems models as frameworks for understanding economic growth and distribution. So this discussion, which is prominent in urban planning and regional studies, mirrors recent discussions in economic geography that have stimulated debates about an evolutionary economic geography that integrates several streams of theory and empirical work on a firm level and network or industry dynamics. In particular, this work has attempted to synthesize a set of complex and parallel projects, including work on embedded and localized nature of innovation, so technological change, life cycle issues of regions, so that's the industry and firms discussion, the industry studies discussion, where you see path dependencies and lock-in play a large role, and then the role of socioeconomic culture or institutional infrastructure in regional development around organizational routines of coordination control. All of these are broadly have fed into the discussion in evolution that has become evolutionary economic geography. As is often the case in these theoretical debates, however, we see a call for further empirical work that would be designed to address some of these more problematic elements of the theories in question, What we see is people who are on the theory, who've developed the theory, want to see some empirical work develop, and that's where all of us come in. So beyond, how do we move beyond the fuzzy concepts and the theoretical frameworks to better understand what it would look like empirically to understand how resilience operates, right? So what we would do is we would look at the services and products themselves that are key components of both of regional innovation systems, but contribute to regional resilience. And we would look at the actors that are involved, including the public sector, the private sector, philanthropic and civic, as well as networks of these types, including third sector networks and firm partnerships. We would look at the processes involved, including devolution, outsourcing, and privatization, which I'm sure all of you study in some detail. And then we would look at the geographies and scales of governance and of action. So this is where we understand multi-scalar approaches as well. So when we look at how regional resilience actually develops, this is where we start to see resilience, and particularly within urban and regional economies, depends on the underlying innovation capacity in the city and region. Now, the following question, of course, would then be, how does that innovation capacity actually develop? So in an era of rapid technological change and devolved governance, innovation occurs both in policy design and policy implementation, as well as in the more formal domains of products, processes, materials, and markets. Innovation is a factor in how resilient firms, intermediaries, and supply chains face shifting market conditions and absorb new technology, and institutional innovation is critical to the resilience of governments and institutions as they create responsive policies. So what we start to see is that we're looking at an aggregation of factors, and we're also looking at the need for there to be innovation in policy models and in policy design, not only in the regional innovation system as we see it in terms of the market factors. So stepping back briefly, we're going to look at this capacity in a more expansive definition of innovation. There is a deep connection to resilience here. A renewed emphasis on open innovation underscores this connection and its meaning to the resilience context. In the context of resilience, innovation is not principally proprietary, and this is an important point. Capacity is iterative. It is not an inevitable element of any given system, but an intentional outcome of its design. Ultimately, investments are required by institutional actors capable of ongoing adaptation and diffusion to ensure consistent systems upgrading. And that is for policy systems as well as for production systems. Crisis response alone is almost always insufficient. Just as a single disruptive innovation brings temporary success to a given firm, it is persistent institutional innovation that associates closely with resilience. So the first thing to look at here is the question of how the evolution of intermediaries happens and how it affects regional economies. And the way to do this is to look where we're more familiar and then move on to understand how to apply this in the context where we have less empirical information. So when we look at typologies of intermediaries, we see a significant amount of variation across national and regional contexts. So one of the things that is helpful here from an empirical perspective is to look at the functions of labor market intermediaries, supply chain intermediaries, and innovation intermediaries, and then understand how they're operating in markets in different contexts. So the first one where we have the most information in the literature, and that includes the empirical literature, is really on how labor market intermediaries go about coordinating skill and technology. So there is a significant literature on the variation across regional contexts in terms of governance, organizational design, and how much advocacy or agency is embedded within labor market intermediaries. Supply chain intermediaries, these are the organizations that actually build firm networks, industry clusters. They are operating in the maker movement, which is also a fairly popular or current area of research of mine and some of my colleagues. So there's a significant literature about how economic development interventions occur within supply chain intermediaries, but there's a lot less going on in terms of the industry-driven organizational models. So rather than models built from the public sector, models built by the private or third sector. And then finally, innovation intermediaries. These are the intermediaries that actually are producing or deploying research and development assets into national or regional innovation systems. There's less empirical work on this as well, but there is a piece of this in the science and technology in policy literature, particularly at the national scale, increasingly in the regional innovation systems literature. So let me pause to say, this is all about trying to map what the underlying assets are that create innovation and build resilience in regions. And the argument here is that it's not just the question of the firm actors or the industry actors or industrial path dependencies, it's also a question of what intermediaries are present and what the path dependencies and adaptive capacities of those intermediaries are. So when we look at the various actors who build or erode regional capacities, we have to look at the fact that there are gaps that have been vacated by the public sector in the wake of neoliberalism and devolution, and that those gaps that have emerged from in some cases that's from the new economy, and there's new spaces that have developed in market spaces. They are also spaces where the public sector has pulled back. So there are profit-seeking actors that have occupied this space. We would call those for-profit intermediaries of one kind or another. But there are also some traditional nonprofits that have occupied some of these spaces as well. And we'll talk specifically about all of these in a moment. So the important thing to keep in mind is it's a moving target to understand what intermediaries are present and what their functions are and whether they're public or private or third sector actors. So the question here is, as we see a more privatization, a more devolution, the question of who is performing functions necessary to resolve market failures at the regional scale, it's not just the public sector. There are also a whole host of other intermediaries that are occupying these spaces. So to put some characteristics onto this, if we look at the supply chain intermediaries, we see a set of firm networks and industry cluster groups of various kinds. You can see some of the ones that I've studied here, specifically mentioned. There's also, in the maker movement, there's particular advocacy and information clearinghouses that are evolving. Technology affects these, whether these are virtual portals and platforms and advocacy, or whether they're physical spaces, or whether they're networks. Really varies based on industry, but also on region. There's also public sector technical assistance programs. And these are mostly mentioned from the US context, but they exist all over. There's also nonprofit partnerships that have evolved. And then, of course, there's private sector consulting firms that operate in these spaces as well, essentially providing information or intermediation services to different actors in the supply chain. So the point here is to keep in mind that it would not work from an empirical analysis perspective to simply look at the private sector, public sector, or nonprofit sector. What we have to look at is who is functionally acting in these spaces, not just their definitional category. So if we move to labor market intermediaries, we see a very similar pattern. So if we define labor market intermediaries as those that are coordinating skill and technology in one way or another, we see that those organizations that are managing skill, certification, and educational attainment and translatability and transferability include organizations that are part of the philanthropic community, like the MacArthur Foundation's Open Badges Project, but also for-profit intermediaries like General Assembly. We see that there are organizations that are facilitating job matching, insurance, retirement, political advocacy for contract and project-based work. These can range from unions, from trade unions, to training organizations, to for-profit intermediaries as well. And what we see that's really interesting in the labor market space is there is a strong differentiation between the organizations that are working with the incumbent labor market, so workers with existing jobs who are being trained up to match skill demands, and new labor market entrants. And then of the three, this is the role of innovation intermediaries, research centers, and hubs. Again, the important point here is to note what the function of these groups are, which is to create translational research centers. And what they are doing is negotiating access to innovation and how it is produced and stored, and particularly intellectual property, technical research resources, and capital. And this varies by national context, regional context, but also by sector and by industry. Clearly, what the kinds of negotiating of access to innovation that happens in the defense industry is distinct from that which occurs in industries that are more civilian or commercially driven. So now that we've looked at the three kinds of intermediaries that we understand the most from the regional economic literature, the innovation literature, and the innovation and resilience literature, it's important to now look at the question of the other institutions that matter in terms of providing capacity for regional resilience. And so one of the things to keep in, this is where we turn to the question of how places develop institutional capacity. So specifically, innovation and governance and policy models by the public sector and among non-governmental institutions can produce or inhibit resilience in regional economies. In the first case, the public and private institutions engaged in service delivery show greater resilience, the ability to adapt to significant changes. When there is an ongoing and conscious integration of design thinking and policy development and investments. The current discussion of how to understand and prioritize and subsequently fund and implement smart cities technology is really a case in point here. So what we see is alternative iterations in the market space. There's a taken for granted assumption that comes through the shift towards neoliberalism by national governments. The devolution project as a whole would really lead to the provisioning of public and collective goods and services would move to the private sector rather than the public sector. This is the idea that neoliberalism would produce more privatization. What in fact has happened is that what we see is variation in how goods and services are actually produced and provisioned. So in some cases, we just don't see what was once public services provisioned at all. And we see this in some kinds of insurance. We see this in some kinds of what we might call social services or public services. We also see that some of these services have been reconfigured in terms of coverage, in terms of amounts, in terms of how baselines. And then we also see that some of these services have been picked up by other intermediaries, whether in the for-profit sector or in the nonprofit sector. And you can think of any number of market areas, housing, land market, labor markets, and see how this has occurred. So when we look at the intermediaries that are actually functioning for the purposes of policy model diffusion, and again, this is an important part of the urban innovation and smart cities discussion, because what we're looking at is the diffusion of new kinds of technologies in a hybrid public-private sector space. How these policy models are diffused matters a lot. And whether they are being diffused and whether places have the institutional capacity in place to absorb the policy models that are actually diffused. So we look at three particular models for how we're seeing urban innovation and smart cities technologies diffused at the city and regional scale. The first model is what we call strategic capacity seeding in cities, and this is where we see a lot of action from third sector actors. So philanthropic funding, for example, this is where we see the efforts by the Rockefeller Foundation, Bloomberg Foundation, such foundations to actually create capacities within city governments This is happening at the international scale and at the the U.S. scale, to try to build capacity around values that are important to the philanthropic entity that's providing the capacity. So one of the most well-known efforts here is really around resilience, and the resilience here is is the 100 Resilient Cities project. This is the third. The visual here is the third round of cities that were accepted into the network. Here, what we see is a policy diffusion across selected networks that are funded and resourced by philanthropic groups as 4 reasons that are priorities of that philanthropic group. In this case, it's resilience, and you'll note that this is the array of international locations that are part of the 100 Resilient Cities network here. Another one of the networks to diffuse technologies into cities, as opposed to diffusing technologies into the private sector, which is what we were talking about earlier when we looked at supply chain, labor market, and research center innovation intermediaries. Here we're looking at the public services, public assets, public technologies side of this, although no one should think that it is, in fact, a public network. So here we see Bloomberg Philanthropies, one of their rounds of innovation teams, which is, again, direct seeding of capacity into city governments for the purposes of creating capacity for the adaptation of urban innovations to the local and regional scale. This, again, is an international group, though they are largely concentrated in the U.S. And again, in order to join this group, you join through a competition. So it is not the case that any city can join. It is the case that cities are competing and winning, and some cities are losing, and are therefore not seeing direct investment into their capacities to become more resilient or more innovative. The second model that we're seeing is one that I characterize as bottom-up organizing. In this case, what we're looking at is movement. This is almost the movement side of creating capacity for adapting to technological change, adapting to new markets, and responding to new modes of production. Here's where you would see the maker movement advocacy. This is where you would see things like maker spaces and co-working spaces, but particularly those that are actually providing new assets and new training. We also see new mutualism here, the idea that collective action at the community scale creates a sufficient solidarity to leverage assets like insurance, like training, and create some sort of market power at the local level. And then the third is what I refer to as capacity building franchise arrangements, and these are efforts that are really look more like national organizations with local affiliates. These are, again, more sophisticated really on the labor market side than they are on the technology diffusion side at this point. They're very much tied into technology training rather than technology diffusion alone, but they actually exist on both sides of on both ends of the labor market. The National Domestic Workers Alliance in the U.S. is a very good example of this. The idea of creating certifications and other kinds of legibility in terms of labor market assets that individuals have, so that there's more transferability across employers, but also clarity about what skills are valued and the value of those skills. So what is emerging, if we think about this as places that have more adaptive capacity, places that are able to absorb innovation, will then actually become more resilient, and that is the case from an economic perspective, but also from their institutional perspective, and the distinctions between the two are rather fuzzy. What we see now is an emergence of privileged places, privileged technologies, and privileged firms, as different places end up with different levels of investment in their innovation capacities, and both coming from the question of public sector investments, but now also third sector and private sector investments as well. So for those of you who are interested in uneven development, this is another place to keep an eye on. So particularly in the smart cities context, we see the philanthropic investments are targeted along values like sustainability, equity, resilience, and civic engagement, and are unevenly distributed. We see private sector partnerships around finding pilot and prototype projects for smart cities unevenly invested, and national governments who are using smart cities as a development strategy, much as they have in the past, see this, again, unevenly distributed to privileged places. So questions about scalability, questions about transferability, and questions about how development will occur going forward are predicated on what is geographically a very uneven landscape. So one of the hopes is that Open Innovation 2.0 would help with this, that bottom-up, that second model that talks about bottom-up organizing might be part of this. So the idea that open innovation also tests the dominance of established and incumbent firms in an emerging market, where a new cohort of innovators is becoming increasingly active, social and civic entrepreneurs. Incumbent firms often use privacy debates to justify proprietary platforms and limit open innovation. This is what we're concerned about. This leads us to a discussion about the covert construction of barriers to entry intended to limit the participants in the smart cities market space. This would be what we're seeing from large firms creating consortiums at the moment. Open innovation platforms, if they were to exist, broadly would ensure interoperability and continuous innovation and competition, whereas proprietary platforms create barriers to entry into this new market that is potentially broad social and economic benefits, well beyond the question of it's sort of public sector resilience alone. So this is where we start to see a rhetorical emphasis on open data, open innovation, and open access among public sector actors in the smart cities debate in particular. So if we start to concentrate research on regional variation, what we start to see is that market failures produce dynamic spaces for intermediaries to assemble a variety of models for meeting this gap. What we see is that neoliberalism is actually producing a set of new value propositions, and that technology change affects this market space through shifting those value propositions. If you think about information access, this is one space in which this is occurring. We also see generational transitions that are affecting this market space, and we're seeing that resource allocation and market management are affecting the space. So this is a dynamic time, and variation between places is allowing for new models to take hold. What we're seeing, though, is the fusion of best practices, those practices that have been vetted and we understand their implications, tends to be really quite limited. The innovative solutions tend to be quite territorially bounded, and that is in part because the best practices that are evolving, the ones that are the most effective, are actually evolving from the bottom up rather than the top down. So if we look at the question of redefining the role of the state at the regional scale, one of the questions here is that there have been, in the wake of all of this devolution, communities have adapted varied responses to local governance through the reorganization of their regional economies and the institutions and institutional intermediaries that actually bind them together. So these responses have been, and this is what we're documenting, uneven, incomplete, and quite regionally differentiated. And they have not all reflected neoliberal positions. So what we see are varieties of neoliberalism, like we see varieties of capitalism, and varieties of neoliberal resistance, meaning that there are places that when devolution occurs, when privatization has occurred, what they decide is they decide to act with their own agency. So the insight here is really that we're seeing regeneration, and that's institutional regeneration through actual innovation of those institutions, and much of this is occurring under the radar, in part because it's empirically difficult to track and requires comparative research. So neoliberalisms they're eroding the base of established and effective institutions that mediate power asymmetries between capital and labor in clear and important ways. Some of those are democratic models that often are then replaced with less democratic ones. And I think it's important to recognize that many of the institutions that we're talking about, particularly labor market intermediaries, were in fact capable of mediating power asymmetries between capital and labor and managing other aspects of labor market intermediation. So it's not the question of whether these intermediaries have failed as there have been transitions in the economy. The issue is that they have been removed. So, however, the core elements of neoliberalism, devolution, deregulation, disinvestment, do not necessarily lead to the same set of shared, replicable, and ideologically neoliberal outcomes across places. What we see is that devolution and deregulation actually lead to new forms of organizing in addition to new markets. And with that, I would like to leave you with some key citations from this conversation. These are pieces that you're welcome to that expand on this talk in greater detail. And with that, I would like to thank you and ask for your questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Clark, for this very interesting presentation. And the floor is open for questions. So if someone has a question, you can either write here in the chat or open your microphone. I myself have one, so I will start asking Professor if there are, like you mentioned about these three models in order to try to develop, like in terms of smart cities. And I'd like to ask you if there are already empirical work that could show some results of the impact of these models in some specific contexts.
So what we're seeing in terms of the specific models in terms of impacts, and this is a real question, is we don't, the way that I would typically measure impacts, right, which is to say that I would want to see something somewhat quantitative on this. I would say that that's still being developed. What we are seeing is that the cities that are part of these networks in these first instance, particularly the ones that are competitive, are continuing to win. So if you're looking for a metric, one of the metrics is that the investments continue to accrue to the cities that are already in the network. So in that case, that is one of the key findings we're seeing. In terms of how the franchise arrangements, particularly the for-profit franchise arrangements, they're constantly being adapted. So what we're seeing is that the firm strategies, in terms of firm strategies for these entities, they are moving their market. They're moving their revenue model shifts consistently, which would make sense because this is a very dynamic space, right? So if you look at something like in the co-working side of smart cities, what we're seeing is that the service delivery for some of those larger franchises is shifting really every 3 to 6 months and adapting increasingly to local conditions.
Thank you, Professor, for your answer. So any questions from? Yes, we have one here from Igor. Professor, can we think in the role of resilience of regional innovation system itself and its effects on the regional development path and capacity to resist to future shocks? Is there a cumulative or dynamic behavior between the resilience of the system of innovation today and the resilience of cities and regions in the future? Well, these are the two questions. Yeah.
Okay, ask that again. It was too long. Tell me, ask it again.
The role of resilience of the regional innovation system itself and its effects on the regional development path and capacity of resist to future shocks?
Okay, so what we're seeing in terms of the regional innovation system itself, it really depends on how far you're scoping that definition. So when if we're talking about essentially the firm network, right? If we're talking about how the firm networks, if they are smaller firm networks, if they are firms that are engaged in multiple markets, so regional resilience in response to, say, market shocks, right? So if what you have is an industry cluster or a regional innovation system that is really dependent on one technology, feeds into one technology or feeds into one industry, they are not very resilient at all. So this is why you see things like a city like Houston, which you might argue by some definitions has a robust regional innovation system if it comes to the energy market, energy and associated sectors. But it is not resilient if what you're actually looking at is the question of disruptions in the energy markets, right? It really affects the entire regional economy. So what works much better is if you have something like a regional innovation system around a technology that has multiple market applications. And this is the work that I did on optics and photonics and continue to do on optics and photonics. One of the reasons I work on optics and photonics is because when you have regions that are specialized in a technology with multiple markets, what ends up happening is if you see an actual exogenous shock to, say, the telecommunications market, which was the early aughts, right? You don't lose your entire region. You don't lose your entire regional economy on this because the individual firms are actually able to adapt to their other markets. So you lose maybe 20% of your demand, but you're not losing 80% of the demand for your industry, and that makes a big deal.
Yeah, and there is also a second question. Is there a cumulative or dynamic behavior between the resilience of the systems of innovation today and the resilience of systems of cities and regions in the future?
Is there a relationship?
Yeah, he said he asked about a cumulative or dynamic behavior, but I don't know. Would you like to rephrase it or ask you again? Yeah, well, Jenny said you already answered. So, actually, Professor, I have a question as well because we had the presentation of Professor Balance 2-3 weeks ago, and he mentioned the aspect of political economy related to this. To the issue of smart cities, and that the discussion is too technical in terms of defining the perfect model, the model that fits best to the problem that cities want to solve, but they don't take into account the political economy aspects related to that, the forces, the political forces, and the interests of the community. So, could I ask you, like, what are your thoughts about that?
I would agree with Pierre Alex on what we're seeing in terms of how smart cities are developing is that there certainly is a tendency, particularly from the for-profit actors who are involved, the transnational corporations and the firms that are involved in smart cities, to want to see a single model, right? Because it is expensive. Tailoring is expensive. It is expensive to actually tailor to local conditions. So there is a desire of some participants in the smart cities discourse to have a one-size-fits-all approach. I do not think that is the case actually for many of the other participants. I think many of the other participants in the smart cities discourse actually see that local tailoring is essential. And do understand the political economy at the local level. And what you see is as different as different cities have moved forward with their smart cities priorities, particularly these are relatively expensive enterprises very often, they prioritize use cases, or they prioritize solutions, all of that in quotation marks, based on what the local conditions are. So what it ends up being what the priorities of the local communities are, whether that's public safety, environmental concerns, transportation. So for example, in a place like Atlanta, we have all of the same array of potential domains where investments in smart cities could occur, but the first set of smart cities investments are really happening in transportation. That's a function of what local concerns are.
Thank you, Professor, for your answer. We have also another question from Marian Atala. The question is, my question is whether using these three models are feasible for designing policies for smart cities in the Middle East, which are suffering for external and internal political turmoils and weak governance and institutions, given the shift of the focus from the public sector to higher dependence on private sector and civil society.
Hi. I thought we were talking about happening in the Middle East context is smart cities is happening in a top-down framework, right? And so, as I think I mentioned this in sort of the middle of the slide presentation, that there are countries that are looking at smart cities essentially the same way they would look at any national economic development project. So this is a national economic development project that's focused on technologically intelligent infrastructure. That would be the way I would say it. So no, I don't think it's connected to civil society right now. I don't know how it could be. I think even in countries where we're seeing relatively robust democracies, we're having a hard time seeing civic engagement drive smart cities priorities. And that's partly because of this question of investment in smart cities objects versus platforms versus infrastructure. The infrastructure that's required for smart cities to be deployed as envisioned is fairly expensive and will require large firms and large government interventions. The objects and the systems could be more diffusely produced, right? But they require some level of that intelligent infrastructure investment.
We also have another question here from Beatriz Calzada. What would be the most important consideration from regions highly concentrated on one type of industry and are more dependent on multinationals in order to be more innovative or resilient? Hello? Hello, Professor, can you hear us? Oh, we can't hear you. Everyone, can you listen me?
Hi, this is Emma French. I'm here with Dr. Clark. Let me see if I can get her on my phone.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
Hi.
Hi, Professor.
I don't know if it's you went off. Can you hear us?
Yes, perfectly. Yes.
Okay, good.
So we couldn't listen after the answer for the last question. If the regions highly concentrated on one type of industry, if they are more dependent on multinational in order to be more innovative or resilient.
Okay. it really depends on. So let me see if I understood the question. The question is a region more dependent on a transnational corporation?
Yeah, Beatrice sent me another question. She said, would it be most important consideration for foreign regions highly concentrated on one type of industry and which are more dependent on multinationals in order to be innovative and resilient? I think she's thinking about the natural resources issue.
Oh yeah. Oh shit, sorry.
I think that ultimately, I'm trying to figure out how to answer that. I mean, the most resilient thing when we do the empirical work, and again, I would encourage you all to do, we need more empirical work on this. So please, you know, if you're looking for topics for research, this would be helpful. But what we're seeing is that that networks are the most resilient system. So that rather than the transnational corporations. Now that's a little confusing. It does depend on whether or not you're looking at large firms who have diversified strategies themselves, right? So what we're seeing now is you see incredibly diversified large transnational corporations. So they're able to do some kinds of adaptations, whether it's you know, something like the tsunami, or whether it's a question of moving around supply chains or adapting products to different and services to different markets. So it does, I would say it depends a lot on the industry. From a regional perspective, if you were looking at it from the position of the region and the negotiation power of the region, you would like to see networks of firms rather than single firms, and part of that just has to do with power asymmetries.
Thank you, Professor. We have another question. Maybe I can ask this one, and then if someone has another question, we can do it. But then we close the session. Policymakers face a lot of resistance from industry when demanding preference for open technologies, for instance, open source software. On the other side, this is an important measure to decrease tech dependence and increase interoperability with legacy systems. So the question is, do you know of interesting cases where policymakers were successful in shaping industry behavior in what concerns to open technologies?
Actually, I would say that right now, one of the situations to watch is a company like Uber, who has been very reticent to provide technology to cities or to anyone to understand what their methodologies are, but they've also been very reticent to provide data. And in just the last 6 months, in part because one speculates that it's in part because of the difficulties Uber has had as a corporation in making with the strategic partnerships it needs to have with cities. It is now releasing some data through a process called Uber Movement. My assessment of Uber Movement is that it is not very important data, but they are releasing some data. So I think that part of this has to do with the tension between the public and the private sector in terms of really use, right? I mean, use of cities, access to citizens. So I do think that there is an opportunity to think strategically about moments of leverage, and then actually negotiating data access agreements that make it possible for there to be open innovation off of open data platforms, so that the data itself doesn't become a mechanism for really preventing more market activity to happen by more actors.
Thank you, Professor. We have a final question from Luca Vettlaufer. He's asking, I'd like to ask what role social capital and social network structure play for the resilience of cities concerning the capacity for social and civic innovation, and how could such a perspective inform policies reinforcing resilient networks?
Right, I think that's a really good question. I mean, I think that this is partly, and this would be helpful too. Again, if for those of you who are looking at research questions, to connect social capital more explicitly to this discussion about resilience and innovation. I mean, obviously, in the mechanics of resilience, when we see resilience, particularly when we're talking about exogenous shocks and natural disasters, these sorts of things, the social capital is actually what holds places together. But we don't actually have a strong, robust theoretical discourse about that idea. What we have is sort of an observational discussion about social capital means that people help each other in different contexts, whether it's helping someone find a job, but it becomes this sort of like voluntary help discussion, right? And what social capital needs to be understood as part of the economic story of places. So I think you do see the social capital particularly operating when you look at this through the institutional innovation lens, because many of the organizations that we're talking about are actually developed by people who have a high level of social capital and are actually connecting to other people who are similarly part of the social capital of their region. Places that have low levels of social capital tend to have low institutional density as a consequence. So these are all sort of the Russian nesting dolls of how you build resilience, right? When we start to look at it simply as a question of firm strategies, and I say this as somebody who has spent her entire career studying firm strategies, what we do is we miss an entire layer of institutional adaptation, institutional dynamics that end up being critical to the story as well.
Thank you again, Professor, and thank you very much for accepting our invitation. This was a very fruitful and very nice presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, and good luck to all of you.
Thank you. So today we finish our last webinar in our series, Innovation in a Regional Context. It has been a pleasure to work in this series. So I'd like to make a very big thank to Igor and the Urban and Economics Working Group. They really were fundamental for the happening of this webinar series, and in the name of Innovation Working Group, we really appreciated working with that. So now the YSI is going to host some events. We're going to have the event in Edinburgh. If you don't know anything about our network, please, you can follow it either on our website, www.ysi.com, I believe, but better to Google it. And we're going to have our presentations all disclosed in our YouTube account. So more information, please go to your Facebook event, and then we're going to put all the links over there. And thank you very much, everyone. And thank you, Igor. So if you have any final words, please.
No, I just want to thank you very much, Professor Jennifer, for accepting our invitation and for such a brilliant talk. And to thank you, Danilo, and the whole Economics of Innovation Working Group. It was a pleasure to organize it, and let's work on more activities together for sure. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for the audience, and see you in the next webinar series. Bye-bye.